All right, so thanks very much, Luke, for being on the show.
My pleasure.
First things first, can you just introduce yourself briefly and what you do, especially with
Sure.
Burden of Command?
Yes. My name's Luke Hughes, and I'm essentially the lead for Burden of Command, which is a leadership RPG role-playing game on the PC, and that's the gist.
Of course, but the reason why I sort of invited you is to talk a little bit about why it is you're developing this
Hmm.
game, what your motivations behind it are, what you think your market niche is,
Right.
and how that sort of influences the development of your game.
Right.
So the first question first really is you've chosen a historical narrative.
Yes.
You've got a strong World War II focus, I take it.
Yes.
Yeah.
For
Um,
now.
for now, why this specific scenario?
Well, I'm particularly interested in this interview and the way you couched it because it's history focused.
Mhm.
So why a historical game and why World War II? And the answer is simple at one level, which is history is personal for me.
Mhm.
So what does that mean? My father was a World War II vet, and he then went on and became a history professor. So shockingly enough, growing up at the dinner table with the history professor who gave pretty much his practice lecture every night, I had really little choice but to become interested in history, and of course had a natural interest in World War II from that. I'm Southern Virginian in the United States, and Southerners have a sort of connection to the military tradition. So I read a lot of Civil War growing up, so I was always interested in military history. And then finally, the last element personally was I was always interested in what it meant to be a leader. And personally, I went into management, business management, and a big firm, Accenture. I spent a lot of time thinking about what it meant to be a leader. I became a business leader. I was a runner for research lab and so forth. I did a startup. And so, when the idea came to me of, you know, a game around leadership, World War II, history, I think I was sort of made for this game. Whether the game succeeds or not, I didn't have any choice but to work on it.
Mm. So, do you think that, I mean, it's a very personal story then for you, why you went
Yes.
with this game. And you already said, like, does it really matter if the game is successful or not? You just want to make the game. Is that what I'm
Uh,
taking from this?
well, okay. So my background is psychology, neurophysiology, AI, and then I'm always an interest in history.
Mm.
So, my personal view is that we believe what we want. In other words, really, probably, if you analyze me, it's personal. On the other hand, I've constructed lots of wonderful reasons why I'm working on this, which I think have some truth.
Mm.
So, why am I doing this? I would like to connect to the people in the past. So the moments that speak to me strongly are, I remember I was a child, I think in Germany actually, and I saw a Roman milestone sitting next to the road. My dad introduced me to. I couldn't believe it. Suddenly I felt the connection of those guys 2,000 years ago. And Burden of Command, we're very consciously trying to connect you to the people. We
Okay.
care about the weaponry. We care about the battles and tactics. But first and foremost, we care about that connection. So the analogy I would make is like Band of Brothers. Band of Brothers, as you may know, I think everybody probably does, but the Tom Hanks World War II historically grounded series connected many people who aren't history buffs to that moment in time, and more importantly, in some ways, those people at that moment. And I hope Burden of Command will connect people who served in the past. So I want that across time, the same way we
Yeah.
try to reach out and connect to people in different countries. History is a different country, right?
All right. And I mean, you've also chosen a scenario, World War II, that's fairly popular. I mean, it's probably one of the most popular historic
Yeah.
themes out there. Um, who do you think within the people that are interested in World War II, or let's say even the gaming community at large, would be interested in your game? What do you think your niche is or your bandwidth of audience?
So I think it's the best. I will go back to Band of Brothers. They're kind of my
Mm.
touchstone, my linchpin, my way to assess how to approach things. And their audience is my audience, I hope. And then I'll
Mm.
add some things to that. So broadly, people who are interested in human stories first. Now, that human story is historically grounded, right? So they like historical series. It doesn't have to be war. I hope that will attract some people who are more interested because we focus on the moral ethical as much as the tactical of leadership. So the game's called Burden of Command,
Mm.
right? It's not called tactical conquest. So we as often and quickly as we can put you in human moral situations. What is a burden of command? It's a tension between your commitment to the mission. Of course, you want to take that hill, right? Because
Yeah.
the war will be over quicker. And your commitment to the men, right? You don't want them to die unnecessarily. Well, depends on your personality, I suppose. You may just be focused on the mission. But we wanted to focus on the moral and ethical and emotional. And so I hope that people who are interested in human stories grounded in historical and military context will be attracted. Now, a little bit more specific answer to you. In terms of gamers, non-gamers a little bit longer. We've had a lot of vets be interested. Why? Because they say, you're the first people in a game, in an interactive experience, to try to convey some of the difficulties of being a leader, as opposed to how do I shoot everybody down and get the flag.
Yeah.
Which is fun. I like those kind of games too. I don't want to pretend to be some nice saint here, but the other parts are pretty interesting too. Like, Winters, the commander in Band of Brothers. Another group, people interested in leadership. I've had a decent number of people who are interested in leadership in business and other contexts approach me. Right? What does it mean to be a leader? War, for better or worse, is a fulcrum, is a crucible of leadership. In fact, we have game moments called crucibles for just that reason, where you suddenly have to define who are you going to be as a leader? Are you going to be cautious, aggressive? Are you going to be, empathetic to your men, or sort of hard nosed to succeed? There's no right answer there. It's your answer. And then finally, in gamers, for those of you who are gamers, people who like XCOM, like tactical games, people who like role playing games like a Baldur's Gate or a Shadowrun or Banner Saga, people who want immersion. And I think I hit all last fun category. This is an unusual one. So there's a Polish game studio called 11-Bit Studio. They pioneered what they call meaningful games. They did a game. I strongly recommend you try it out if you haven't, just for an unusual experience called This War of Mine.
Yeah.
And it says, it says the slogan is, in war, not everyone is a soldier. I may have it slightly wrong. I think that's it. And it focuses on the civilians in a kind of Sarajevo-like situation. And they interviewed Sarajevo survivors. And who wants to play that game, man? That doesn't sound fun. It sounds miserable. In fact, there's a lot of misery in the game. Fascinatingly, they're probably up to 1 million sales now. There were 700,000 sales a few years ago. Polish government just picked them for reading list for school. So they focus on meaningful games.
Yeah.
Our goal is not to give you fun. Our goal is to give you a engaging, perhaps, I hope, meaningful experience. So if you're interested in that, that's what we're about. If you're out to have a shoot 'em up, we're not so much about that.
So, so you have that sort of passion of creating, a meaningful game and something that really makes people understand who are the leaders involved, what sort of decisions do they have to take, and what are the human stories. Yes, and who are they? How do you square that with the question that I obviously have to ask? What's the economic feasibility here? Because on the one hand side, it's unique. It might be a title that really blows up, but on the other hand, you're taking sort of a risk here because it's a path that is seldom trodden, and you have to stand out essentially. Well, you're standing out with your uniqueness, but at the same time, that might also just make you not seem as appealing to an audience that is used to a certain kind of game.
Well said. So I love the business question. So, I said I worked for Accenture, which was a business consulting firm. So I was not a business master, but I was around a lot of hardcore, what called C-level officers, CEOs and below. So I heard a lot of business conversations. We thought about business. So trust me, I thought a lot about the business side of burden of command. I did not sit here and say, I'd love to do this. I'm going to go do it. I did a business model, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Now, here's my business take. If you look at history games, you see this interesting phenomenon. You have very successful, visceral history games like first-person shooters. Classic one is Medal of Honor. You run around, and my God, do they immerse you? I mean, you feel like you're on the beach at Normandy. It's compelling. I give them a lot of credit for that. On the other hand, it has sort of a weird feature, right? Which is, I just died, reload. Death is an inconvenience in that kind of game. So that has high success, but really we can't go that direction, and it's been done better than we can ever do, because we're trying to be authentic about the experience. So for instance, in our game, permadeath, meaning you die, you die. You send a lieutenant out to take the hill, he dies, he's not coming back. I'm sure some clever hacker can break us, but otherwise, no. So the other type of game, which on a business level that focus on history, is hardcore. So what you might know the term grognard. I bet
Yeah.
few of your listeners are grognards. So they're very interested in either the tactics or the equipment. I'm interested in the tactics and equipment. Trust me. I played a lot of board war games and so forth in my past, so I'm not disparaging. But that niche, especially the sort of tactical war game, very small. Why is it that the first person shooter, very large audiences, the historical tactical play Gettysburg, small audiences typically,
Hmm.
Band of Brothers, very large audience, and not just males, etc. Why
Yeah.
is that? And I think the answer is actually rather clear. Human connection. People want to most easily engage to the moment and to the person rather than to abstractions. And so I think, in principle, burden of command has a strong chance because we focus on people. So whether we execute correctly is a different issue. But I think the focus is a way that historical minded games can broaden. And I can tell you, here you are talking to me. You have a successful channel. That's not chance, in my opinion, because I think the topic interests people.
Hmm.
We had Forbes magazine cover us. I don't think that's chance. People are engaged by the topic. Again, I'm not saying we're going to do it right. I'm saying the topic is engaging. And then my last business remark is indie games and gaming in general is insane now. So those of you who pay any attention to the industry, I think the Apple Store is 500 games a day. I just saw something like that yesterday. I think on Steam, on a PC, it's several thousand a month. It's impossible for indies. So if you want to have any chance to survive, you need to be distinctive. We're distinctive. Nobody's done, as far as we're aware, a leadership RPG. So if I were just sitting out here as a hard-nosed businessman trying to make a buck, I would still be focused on being distinctive to have any chance in this market. Unless, I have millions of dollars because I belong to an enormous studio and I can command your attention through advertising. I cannot command your attention through advertising.
Right.
So I have to stand out. So
Yeah.
I feel good about the business case for it, but I'm not claiming we're going to get rich. But I think we'll get attention if we execute well.
Awesome. And you sort of touched a little bit upon it already on sort of the mechanics of the game with what you've been talking
Mm-hmm.
about. But before we go down that route, question: so we sort of often have these buzzwords in the gaming community, right? When it comes to history games, realism, authenticity,
Yes.
and gameplay. Where do you think you're going, and what do you think? What should be the primary concern, maybe, if for games that do sort of historic content?
Excellent. Authenticity is such an interesting problem. So first, we are not going to succeed on the classic definition of authenticity. I don't mean not succeed. I mean we will not be the best. So
Mm.
for instance, in the sort of ground combat, there is, for example, a game some of your watchers will know, Combat Mission,
Hmm.
hardcore, modeling the bullets and the armor and the penetration, and we'll never be as good as them at that. I'm sure you can find some other examples, Armada, etc. Similarly, your flight sim fans, I'm sure, my God, I sure as hell am not going to try to compete with the authentic,
Yeah.
reproduction of, pick your favorite tank or MG42 or so forth. That being said, I think we can compete on a different form of authenticity that isn't approached as much in the spirit of this war of mine. And I would call that emotional authenticity. So what does that mean? We want to focus on the psychological experience of the leaders in particular, soldiers also, but leaders in particular. What are their burden of command moments?
Hmm.
Um, Ideally, drawn from history. I constantly encourage the writers, hey, history is almost always stranger in fiction. Go find a moral dilemma or a burden of command decision from history because they're all over the place.
Yeah.
And I promise you, people read your example and I say, oh, please, that's Hollywood. But we put little bookmarks in the interactive fiction. You can mouse over, not oblige, and say, well, that actually happened. Here's,
Oh, wow. Okay.
here's the real version. Because connect to history. Remember the goal?
Yeah.
So anyway, emotional authenticity, emotional situations. This War of Mine showed that was compelling. There's another meaning to emotional authenticity that I think will interest gamers and people interested in war, battlefield psychology. So as I mentioned, my background, I have a master's in neurophysiology and psychology. I did a PhD in AI, but it was human focused.
Hmm.
In other words, how can I use AI techniques to understand what's going on here? And I was always most interested in the emotional activity of what's going here. How do I believe mostly our feelings drive our thoughts. We'd like to believe our thinking drives our emotions, but I don't see great evidence for that, especially not these days. But but anyway, sorry. I think we can all agree on that, whatever our positions. So, battlefield, emotional psychology. The battlefield is a human place still. Maybe that will change with the bots. But for now, it's a lot about the leadership and the esprit de corps or lack thereof of the men. So I've talked to people who are experts on that. We have a lot of vets I've mentioned. We have a guy I talked to who wrote a wonderful book called Brains and Bullets. I'll give you an example. So a group of soldiers are considering assaulting enemy position. Now, on their own, this is all very soft. When I give you a statistic here, it's all very soft. But, the best book like that can estimate something like 25, 35% chance they're going to go out and get themselves killed trying to do this heroic act. You give them, a recognized commander, sergeant or officer, and it goes up to something like, I'm forgetting my statistics now, 45 to 50. You give them a respected leader. Again, could be an NCO, non-commissioned officer, could be an officer.
Mm-hmm.
Goes up to 70%. What's my point? Rational people don't want to die. Who of us wants to really go out, stand up, and, shoot me with a bullet to help the cause? Yes, we'll do it if we're wonderful people, maybe. But it's not a natural act.
Yeah.
And so in our battlefield, as like the real one, when you order your men to assault a position, they think about it. So if there's tons of machine gun fire coming down on them, if they're suppressed, is our technical term, they're probably not going to, unless you're an extremely good leader and they're very experienced kind of band of brothers, right? They might, but the green guys are not going to. Maybe you'll persuade them. So that's an example. In fact, what I did was study what are the classic situations from Napoleonic War, ancient combat, modern, when morale checks, to use a gamer term, happen. When units decide whether they will do a risky action or not, or they'll run. And I'll give you a lot more examples there. I'll give you one last one for fun, and then I'll let you drive the conversation again. Normandy, World War II, green American troops, not all green, but in this case. So hedgerows, you've heard about that,
Sure.
almost like walls. Yeah. They've got to cross the open. The Germans have planned for this. So the US soldiers run out into the open. Now they're somewhat green, some of these units. They take fire. What is your instinctual morale check response? Do you want to guess? What do you do when you take fire? You're running across the field.
I mean, I would say rationally, I would jump down and
exactly.
Yeah.
Rational act is you hit the ground. I mean, unless you're insane. So that's what they did. Germans are smart, right? They had pre-planned mortar positions for the middle of the field, anticipating this would be the response. Casualties were extremely high from mortars, not from the bullet fire. So veteran troops, on the other hand, learned their survivability, and the leaders did, was tied to not stopping and running all the way across the field. So there you go again. It's a psychological action to be successful and an experience action rather than execute plan Z in position 32 on these map coordinates. Oh, we worked, and fire the gun. World War II, 8,000 bullets before casualty. It was about psychology, not about, bang, 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 you're dead.
Great. So the original question that sort of, prompted your explanation there was sort of from your perspective. Now, again, we have a lot of gamers who, when they give criticism to games, they use those words, right? Authenticity, realism, and they always say, we want this, we want that. Yeah. Why isn't the game like this? Why isn't it like that? And it always, or often at least, I see it revolving about, sort of well-known topics or well-known myths, sometimes well-known archetypes of things that happened during a specific conflict, like World War II, and they want that in a game.
Yes.
And why isn't that in a game? But at the other hand, you still see very successful games like Battlefield series doing certain things that upset gamers, but still those games get bought. So the question here is, from your business perspective, what do gamers actually want?
Well, we'd all be rich if we knew the answer to that. But I think the answer is probably somewhere in the space of they want familiarity, but sufficient novelty in that space. So you see that all the time in sequels, right? You give them a radically different one, they're upset because they had certain expectations. On the other hand, if it just feels like more of the same, they're also upset. So getting in between. So we have a similar challenge in the sense that I can make the game radically different in a lot of mechanics.
Mhm.
And, I have this vision, I change everything to fit it. And that could work. There are certain games that go that way, but that's an increased risk. What I tried to do was focus on certain central things were different while maintaining some things that are familiar. So for instance, a lot of the core mechanics you might recognize from an XCOM. There's a certain number of actions the units have. On the other hand, our leaders have action that are the core capacity of the platoon to do things for the lieutenants. So it's not just about the unit having actions. I respect certain conventions from the board gaming tradition. There's a long tradition, like Squad Leader back in the day, of tactical, human-focused war games, they're called. And I draw on some of those traditions. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel everywhere. What I am trying to do is focus on certain leadership, almost obsessively leadership aspects of each thing. So on a battlefield, I try to keep the focus on the leaders. The leaders are the most decisive elements in the battlefield or we're failing. They're where you make your core decisions to make things happen in the battlefield. I take these leaders off the battlefield. I shouldn't say the writers, the scenario designers, the the vets are working so hard to get our historical portraits from history. I try to take you off the battlefield as a leader and put you in situations in Naples, which was a very interesting place to be in World War II Italy, off duty. Naples has had a reputation.
It still
I think
has in that
it still
regard.
does probably, but I don't know. No offense. But Naples is an interesting place for moral decisions. We deal with paperwork. Realistic leadership, there's a lot of paperwork. Strangely enough, there's a game called Papers, Please that was highly successful about
Yes.
being a paper stamper and a
Yeah.
passport, because there are a lot of moral decisions around passports, depending on the regime you're working for. One of the more compelling moments in Burden of Command is when I had to worry about gasoline supplies. And I spent the next few scenes sweating it, in some ways almost more than on the battlefield, because what the writers had cleverly done to me. I tried to be clever about getting some extra gas, and they made me pay. And I was thinking, oh my God, am I going to get caught? So, Burden of Command comes in a lot of flavors. We don't try to do everything novel, but certain focus things we do.
Okay. And in those things that you do, I mean, there must be a huge list of mechanics, and you sort of, I'm presuming that you have sort of a tree of decisions that you've sort of carved out with your writers. But talking about specifically with mechanics, is there anything where initially when you were thinking about doing this game, you really wanted to put this in your game, and then as you realized, as you're developing the game, putting that mechanic in is either going to take you down a road which it's gonna blow up, or it's gonna even take the game or make it less fun or less compelling, or
right. I want to spend 20 more seconds to your previous question. I hope people will challenge us on emotional authenticity, by the way. It's much softer. So I'm certain most people will disagree in one way or another. I hope we'll start a conversation, right? What was the right decision? We hope what we'll see is people debating, no, that was the right decision. No, that was. And there's enough debate about the MG42 rate of fire, which we've had many debates inside the team. I'm sure the equivalent's in the air. But
there's a lot of
it'll be worse on emotional side. And by the way, for your aviation folks in that, I wanted to call shout out for 12 O'Clock High, as a Burden of Command movie in the air. There's some other examples like that. And I hope Mighty Eighth will be like that. Back to your question, which I would take gist of it is, what did we have to cut? So I'll give you some, I'm going to stay in, there are many things we had to cut because that's the nature of the beast. And we're an inexperienced team that's learning, but I want to focus on the history ones. So to an inordinate degree, we cut NCOs, which I feel badly about. So let me explain that one. I think many vets would say that the backbone of the morale of the units, the squads and platoons, is the NCOs, the sergeants and corporals and so forth. I tend to agree with that. We have a fair number of those on the team. So why didn't I make them central? It's a leadership RPG. So we have to give you a limited number of characters to focus on. If we give you a party with 100 characters, I mean, maybe Crusader's King, can pull that off from medieval times. So they had some issues in the original one. And I think that both Crusader Kings 3 is changing. My focus was, let's give them a limited number of people to connect to. Now, one of those is an NCO, Sergeant Grant, first sergeant. But mostly it's lieutenants and the captain, because you're going to be the captain. So for game focus and mechanics, we limited the quantity of characters. And so we couldn't put in all the people we should on a historical basis. Now, we may do an armored one eventually, in which case you'd probably be stuck in the tank in the Spirit of Fury, in which case it'd be great to focus especially on enlisted, right, and NCOs. Okay, but so for simplicity, we picked the most obvious definition of leaders and limited the number of characters. Another example is, this was a tricky one. We didn't really realize till we got into doing it. So we have a professional historian, John McManus, who is an eminent military historian. He's also the lead historian for the Cotton Balers. They are 7th Regiment, U.S. 3rd Infantry Division. We follow them specifically. He's their official historian as well. He's read everything we do, given us critiques. We have an interesting problem, which is, suppose you had an interaction with Patton. And you want Pat, and we know there are, for instance, issues around Patton with the slapping the soldier. And we want you to say, I'm making this up, we don't do this. You want to say something to Patton, which probably you'd never get a chance as lieutenant anyway. So, but take the spirit of the example. And should Patton act differently? What if you said just the right thing? You change his mind. In game terms, maybe. Now, very tricky on many fronts for reality. First, who are any historical commander's decision that is questionable? Who are we to judge? We weren't there in 1943 or 42, or pick your year, for this lieutenant or captain or general in their particular context. I mean, we have a lot of nerve to go and say, well, no, it should be done a different way. So first, dangerous. Secondly, legally, you become an issue, right, depending on the number of years, because if you say something and they behave worse, could be a libel issue. So we had to be very careful. I mean, in principle, it's very tricky terrain. My point is, we had to figure out what to do about historical characters. Further, what if we wanted you to play, think of Band of Brothers, clean example. What if we wanted you to be winners? That first wouldn't really be right, I think, to be winners without the permission of the winner's family. So even if you could, my God, I mean, you're manipulating historical people. So what was our solution? We made two choices. Decided we were not going to change the actions of historical characters. It was too tricky, not our right, and just hard terrain. So we made you in charge of a fictional company inside the Cotton Balers. You go to Cotton Baler battles, you're in historical situations, the company is fictional. That gave us freedom to pursue outcomes of decisions, good and bad, without sort of violating history. Because one of our rules is bend but do not break history. Okay. Another variation of that was, I think that's my core point. I could go on, but the gist is, we decided to not mess with the historical record around historical people, and we solved the problem by freeing ourselves up in terms of who we represent. Now, you do meet historical characters, but we stick to kind of what we know happened insofar as we understand it.
Awesome. Well, look, I think it's shaping up to be quite a unique experience. I'm definitely looking forward to it as well. And I want to thank you for the sort of the honest and frank answers you've given to my questions. It's not often that you see somebody, discussing both the business and sort of the passion behind the project. So very much appreciated that you did that. Is there anything left you would like to say, explain about your own product, the Burden of Command, or any of the questions that where you were like, oh, I wanted to make a point about that one, and we just couldn't?
Thank you. First, I really appreciated the sort of fresh angle of questions. Some of these questions I've never gotten before, so I really enjoyed that. Secondly, I just want to say it's an honor to talk to your audience in particular. My wife is a U.S. Air Force vet. I had a son in the U.S. Air Force. One of my best friends was a Top Gun for the U.S. Air Force. Nice. So I've had a lot of connection to Air Force. Maybe there'll be a Burden of Command someday in an Air Force context. I'd love to have ideas thrown at me, but I'll watch The Mighty Eighth, and maybe that'll get my juices flowing. That's number one. Number two is, I couldn't do this game without the vets in particular on this team, but also many other types of people. So we've had, for instance, I'm not only telling this to give them credit, but I think it will interest the audience. For instance, we have William Bernhardt, who's a author whose fiction works have sold millions of copies, and he gave us a lot of advice on the writing. We've had, as I said, John McManus. We have Gordon Rotman, who's written 143 books on military topics and was a Green Beret in Vietnam. So
Wow.
and he wrote a book on slang. So for instance, to show our obsession, he went through all our stuff to try to make sure our slang was, authentic. And for instance, things like the enlisted curse and the officer's less, because there was a class distinction in World War II. So my closing point is I'd ask your audience, reach out to me, give me your comments and thoughts and examples from ground or air. And this is obviously self-interested, but I do mean this. I run our Twitter account, at Burden of Command. I try to talk to anybody who wants to talk to me there, because I love meeting people who are engaged by history. Tell me where I was wrong. Occasionally, you can tell me where I was right too. We have Facebook, we have Steam account. Help us improve. And last sentence, we're not going to do it right. That's an interesting quote. I promise you we're not going to do it right. It's hard. On the other hand, what I hope we're doing is we're opening the door to deal with historical military situations in a way that we think has not been done in a game before. And we hope your audience and you will help us go on that journey to get better and better at it. We're opening the door. We're not claiming to do it right.
Excellent. Well, I wish you all the best. I'm pretty sure my audience wishes you all the best as well. They're not here yet, but I'm sure they'll enjoy the talk as well. Yeah, thanks very much. And
My pleasure.
I definitely hope to keep an eye on Burden of Command and see where it goes.
Thank you for your time today.